the culture of classical Greece. The objectives for this section: 1. Discuss the Greek philosophers and their concern with the development of critical and rational thought about the nature of the universe. And 2, summarize the Greek belief that ritualized religion was necessary. Now, first, when we begin to talk about religion, religion is significantly different in an ancient world sense than the modern sense of religion. Religion affected every aspect of Greek life. It wasn't compartmentalized like it is in modern society. See, in modern society, particularly in Western tradition, now today in the 20th century, anyone who is religious tends to have compartments in their life. That is, here is home and family, here is work, here is religion. There is no sense in which that occurred. In fact, these were interconnected, an intricate web of society and life. Now, the Greek traditional religious structure, as we'll see, had several chief gods among them, 12 in precise, 12 chief gods and goddesses who lived on Mount Olympus. Now, we have the Greek pantheon in tradition: Zeus, Athena, Apollo, Ares, Aphrodite, Poseidon, all of these very familiar in Greek myth and religion. Now, Greek religion did not have a body of doctrine. In fact, it didn't necessarily focus on doctrine in sort of Judeo-Christian Islamic sort of sense, right? When we talk about Christianity, or we talk about Islam or Judaism, we end up talking about what are the proper ways to believe? What are the proper ideas? But that was not the Greek sort of sense. Greeks were focused on morality. In some sense, but not the sort of morality that we would talk about, the rights and wrongs, per se. I mean, they don't create laws in the sense of you sinned or not. What they were focused on in a morality sense is rituals. That is, the ritual behavior that is moral, that led to proper religious practice in life. That is, prayers and sacrifices, observing the proper festivals, going to the right athletic games. That was the moral and right thing to do. And through those rituals, through those practices, one became a right or pious person. And so it's not the Western traditional model. Now, of course, the sort of Greek idea of gods were not necessarily the supreme being in a kind of Judeo-Christian sort of sense, but a being who was more powerful than a human. And that's what they mean by a god. And so when Christianity arises, as we'll see, Christianity will make distinctions between, for example, angels and the supreme God, when the Greeks would have not distinguished between the two, because while they would have saw one God as more supreme, they were all gods because they were more powerful than humans. And this is, of course, a distinction that will later be made, but here in the Greek context, anyone that was more than human was God or demigod, something like Hercules, for example. Now, the Greeks also had a great desire to learn the will of the gods. They wanted to know what the gods wanted, and so often they would visit oracles. Now, oracles were sacred shrines where a god or goddess would reside and reveal the future or some hidden knowledge through a priest or priestess. The most famous example of this would be Apollo, the god Apollo at Delphi, and the oracle at Delphi would be able to tell the future or some hidden knowledge, which is a painting here depicted of what that looked like. Now, the famous story was that one young man went to go find from the oracle of Delphi what was the truth, who was the smartest man alive. And so the Apollo would whisper the truth through a crack in the earth, and through the smoke and through the whispers, the oracle would hear it and give the answer. Now, the answer to this person's question was Socrates. Now, we'll talk about this man, Socrates, in a little bit. and will finish the story because this man is perplexed at this answer and goes to find this Socrates fellow. Now, following also this intellectual aspect of religion was Greek drama. Drama was created by the Greeks and played out outdoors, in outdoor theaters and amphitheaters, perfectly designed to allow for the sound to carry in a dramatic sense. Now, often, these sorts of stories that were told were largely tragedies. Tragedies were often presented in trilogies, in cycles of 3. Now, the best example of this would be Aeschylus, particularly Aeschylus's Orestia. Now, these plays related the fate of Agamemnon, what happened to Agamemnon after the Battle of Troy. And so these kind of characterize what happened after those events. Other examples might be Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, a very famous story in which Sophocles tells of this young boy who ends up finding out that through various circumstances that he had killed his own father, slept with his own mother on accident, and ends up famously boring out his own eyes in the end. A very classic traditional story that all must read. Now, Greek tragedies dealt with, in general, universal themes that are still, in some sense, relevant today and why we still read them. The nature of good and evil, for example. The rights of the individual versus the state. Nature of divine forces in general. The nature of human beings. These tragedies tap into the human being and the human existence. Now, that's really what kind of drives Greek philosophy, is the nature of reality and of the human existence. Now, philosophy is also in Greek classical culture one of the most important legacies developed for Western society and global history. Now, philosophy means the love of wisdom, and developed among Greeks as a critical or rational thought system about the nature of the universe. Now, one of the most earliest Greek philosophers was Pythagoras. Now, Pythagoras taught that the essence of the universe could be found in music and in numbers. He believed that the universe itself was ordered and structured in numbers, and if numbers were studied through the universe, that one could tap into true meaning. But by the 4th century, some of the major philosophers of Western civilization arise. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. These are really considered the fathers of classical philosophy. But these, of course, emerged on the backs of the Sophists. Now, the Sophists were a group of traveling teachers, essentially. And these teachers in ancient Greece hired themselves out to wealthy people, particularly wealthy people's kids, and taught them things, particularly the art of rhetoric. And they argued that it was beyond the reach of the human mind to understand the universe, and that they should instead focus on not the essence of things, perhaps, but the art of rhetoric and speaking well, and things like that. So they sold their services. They were teachers, and they stressed that, yes, rhetoric, but also denied the absolute truth of the essence of things, or at least that it could be known. And to them, true wisdom consists of being able to perceive and pursue one's own good rather than necessarily goodness itself. Because, of course, they didn't know what goodness was per se, but they knew what one individual might want for themselves. It really sounds a lot like the 20th century now and the 21st century philosophy. But one of the critics of the Sophists was the outspoken Socrates, who was actually a sculptor who became a philosopher. Now, as I said before, if you'll recall, the Oracle of Delphi had said that he was the smartest man in the world. And so the person came to him and said, Socrates, they said that you're the smartest man in the world. And he said, I don't understand that because I don't know anything. And so he went about all over the place asking people who knew things, or supposedly knew things, what they were. And he was after the essence of what that thing was. So, for example, he'd go to a judge and ask that judge, what is justice? Now, of course, the judge should know what justice is, but that prosecuting attorney or that judge didn't know. And so this was something that baffled him. Or he'd go to the poet and ask what love is. Or he'd ask a king, what is justice or what is good? No one knew any of these answers. And ultimately, he gathered around himself a bunch of young people who liked to follow him around and see all the wealthy, powerful people squirm as Socrates asked them questions. Now, Socrates himself wrote nothing down, which is fascinating because he claimed that he knew nothing, and ultimately he came to the conclusion that this is why he was the smartest man in the world, because he knew that he knew nothing when everyone else in the world thought they knew stuff, but they don't. So he was not ignorant. He was aware of his ignorance, while everyone else was ignorant of their ignorance. So he wrote nothing, but Plato, one of his main pupils, his students, collected his teachings and wrote them down. And that is how we have them today. Now, Socrates believed that the goal of education was only to improve the individual to become a philosopher, not for rote memorization or degrees or anything like that. And this could only be done through the Socratic method, not through rote memorization like the sophists believed was the case. And so he questioned authority, but he questioned authority in an age where debate and changing authority was distrusted. Remember, he's coming on the heels of the Peloponnesian War, the Persian War, and the society had been fractured and dismantled in such a way that people distrusted Socrates. And when in an age when the authorities needed to be trusted, he called them into question. And so he was ultimately sentenced to death by drinking hemlock, a poison, which is apparently very painful. Now, Plato writes down in dialogue all the things that Socrates had said. Now, the question becomes, what is Plato and what is Socrates? What is actually Socrates and what is Plato, or what is Plato's and not Socrates? Most philosophers and historians argue that a certain set of group of writings belong to Socrates, but later Plato, using Socrates, formulated his own ideas. Now, just to lay it out there then, Socrates focused on finding the essence of things, but never did. Plato, however, takes a step further and argues for something called the forms. That is, there is a higher world of eternal things, unchanging things above everything else. And these are the forms, the ideal forms that make up reality. So, for example, we have the idea of trees, which are sensed, and treeness, which is the ideal form. So when we look at trees, I might say to you, what is that tree? Or can you tell me what a tree is? And someone might point to a palm tree, or to some other tree that looks like a bush, or some other tree. Now the problem is that these trees are not the same. They are similar. And we sense them, and we see them, and we point out their differences. But what is it that makes them both tree? What is the unifying thing that makes them both tree? And that is called treeness. That is the ideal form, the thing that participates in tree. Or, for example, in a true sense, the Republic, in that masterful work, asks what is good. And the people there give him examples of good, saying, well, it's good to help Granny across the street, or it's good to feed the poor, or something like that. And that might be what I ask you. What is good? And you would give me those examples. But that is not good itself. Those are examples of good. But what is goodness? What is the thing that they ultimately participate in? What is that final form? And that's exactly what Plato argues, that there is a set of forms above all the universe, of perfect things that the entire universe interrelates with. And that is the form, goodness, treeness. So here we see this example then. two examples of trees, but they participate in tree-ness, the ultimate form of tree that resides in some other universal place, a heaven-like place that makes the other ones tree. This is Plato's theory. Now, of course, Aristotle is Plato's student, right? So Plato was Socrates' student. Now, Aristotle is Plato's student. Plato established a school in Athens known as the Academy and had many students. His most famous, of course, is Aristotle. Now, Aristotle did not accept Plato's theory of the ideal forms as a part of things themselves. He doesn't say, hey, these things are by themselves. Treeness is known by examining trees, he says. So, for example, you want to know what this universal treeness is? Well, let's look at all the trees and find out what their similarities are, and then we come at treeness. Well, for example, if we wanted to know what goodness is, then we would look at all examples of good and then come to the conclusion of what goodness is. What is it that they all participate in? And so this is Aristotle's pursuit in a very scientific method. Aristotle's interests lay in analyzing and classifying things based on observation and investigation. And he wrote books on everything, on ethics, logic, politics, poetry, astronomy, geology, biology, physics. He wrote, in fact, the first book on zoology. In fact, Aristotle's books, all collected, if they had not all been destroyed even in human history, could not fill the room that you're listening to this in. He could not stop himself from writing constantly and questioning and analyzing everything. And so Aristotle is considered the kind of father or end result of this philosophic system. And his thoughts and his approach reverberate through human history up to the modern era. Now, there are other disciplines after philosophy that also have a long legacy. History, for example. And the writing of history, you can thank the early Greek historians for the necessity of you even taking this class. History, as we know it, was created in the Western world. Now, Herodotus is the first to write a history, the history of the Persian Wars, which was a conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, and Greek freedom and Persian despotism, and that was the kind of theme. But Herodotus mixes his historical analysis with all sorts of mythic and religious sort of contexts and motives and reasons. It's Thucydides, really, that ends up writing a pure history in the sense that we would recognize. Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars was not concerned with divine forces or gods, but focused on the people and the events and the battles and how things occurred. And this seems much more like the kind of history that we talk about. So war and politics were in purely human terms, and really as an activity of human beings, not an activity of the divine. I mean, if you read the Iliad, for example, the Iliad is not a history of the Battle of Troy, but really a conflict between the gods. But here, Thucydides makes no mention of gods, but focuses on the events that had occurred as a result of the activities of humans. And so we see a major shift then in the writing of history and writing of the past. And so these are the sorts of trends that are occurring. Now, the classical ideas of Greek art, too, are very human-based. So the classical Greek art was concerned with expressing eternal ideas like reason, moderation, balance, harmony. These are some of the major ideals that crop up from true Greek Athenian art. So some of the finest examples of Greek classical architecture might be seen even in Athens in the 5th century at the Parthenon, which you can see much of this in the British Museum or in Athens itself. And the Parthenon, dedicated to Athena, whose name Athens gets its name from Athena, who is the patron goddess of the city. And so we see examples of this harmony and balance, but also sort of realism when you look at it. There's the figures, ideal, yes, but a realism of the people. And so Greek sculptors did not seek to achieve realism, perhaps, but rather a standard of ideal beauty. So they aren't pointing out the flaws of people, but the ideal human form. So when they carve a person, they want that person to look like a person, but the ideal form of a person. So that's why when you look at Greek art, particularly the male or the female, it's trying to capture the essence of humanity, of true beauty in the human itself. That is, what does the ideal man look like? In fact, the male body was seen as the pinnacle of beauty. It's very different than Roman and Western Judeo-Christian tradition all the way up into the 20th century, where the woman's body seems to be the ideal of beauty. No, in the Greek culture, the male's body was the pinnacle of beauty. And that's why you had so many male nudes in the Greek context. Now, the objectives for this discussion on classical Greek culture was 1, discuss the Greek philosophers and their concern with the development of critical and rational thought about the nature of the universe. And 2, summarize the Greek belief that ritualized religion was necessary. That is, rituals versus morality or doctrine theology. So the focus on proper behavior in terms of prayer and sacrifice.